Hello, welcome.
Oh, sorry, I missed what you just said.
I just said hello and welcome.
Oh, hi.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good.
Doing okay. Yeah. I'm gonna change my name. You can see me. Looks like we have one other person. We're just gonna give folks a couple minutes to sign on, but we are expecting a smaller class tonight. So that will be just great because we'll have more time to chat among us. Of course, it's always nice to have people join us as well. Yeah, so we'll just, people are coming on. Welcome, hello and welcome. Oh, look at that pup dog. What a sweetie. Um, so just to let you guys know, I'm just gonna give people a couple more minutes to sign on. This is being recorded, so it will both be available to folks after tonight to watch, and it is also being live streamed on Facebook. If you do turn on your camera or unmute yourself, that will be captured in the recording. So if you don't want to be in the recording, feel free to just keep yourself muted or your camera off. We will be using the chat box feature tonight. It's a great way to type in any questions or comments that you have, and the chat box is also kept in the recording. So if you have anything that you want to ask but you don't want other people to know about it, you can chat me privately by selecting right where you type, right up to the left, there is a drop down and it says everyone, or you can pick someone else specifically to send a meeting to, and that way it will be kept private. We'll just give people a couple more minutes to sign on here. We'll give folks maybe one more minute and then we'll go ahead and get started. I do think that we have a smaller group signed up for tonight. All right, well, I think we'll go ahead and get started, and we may have some other folks join us later on, but it's always nice to have a small group on I am wondering if you guys can hear me well, or if I need to speak louder. How is my audio? Sound good? Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. This is class 4 of a 4-class series that Growing Hope is putting on Gardening 101. There will be more workshops in the future at Growing Hope. The first event of the year is actually coinciding at the same time. At Growing Hope right now, they're having a seedling party. Every year we grow out thousands and thousands of seedlings for working class folks in the Ypsi area, and tonight is the first night that we're putting them into 4-packs that will be then distributed out. So spring is coming. I am going to switch over from my face to share my screen with you guys with some slides. Before I do that, I just wanted to point out that we will be recording tonight's presentation, and it is also being streamed live on Facebook. The images of the participants as well as the names are recorded, and the chat feature as well. So if you don't want to be recorded, or if you don't want your image on Facebook Live, feel free to keep your camera off and stay muted. At any time you can unmute yourself to ask questions, and I'll keep the chat feature open so I can also see the questions as they come in. I think you guys all got your names set up, so that is great. And we will go ahead and switch to the slides. All right, let's go to the first slide. All right, let's see. So, am I still coming across okay? Is my my audio good? And can you guys see, it should say Gardening 101, and there should be a picture of me in front of spinach on your screens. Are you guys seeing that okay? Oops. So we just lost it for a second. Let's go back. Let's see. All right. Oh, sorry. Even though this is like the 4th time, I just sometimes still have a little trouble with the Zoom. Can I just get some feedback from you guys on what you're seeing right now? Are you guys seeing the should say agenda class 4?
Yes, we're seeing that.
You are. Okay, great. All right. I will go back to the presentation then. All right, so welcome. I started with this picture for tonight because this is not a picture from today. This is from a couple years ago, but this is actually what the hoop house at Growing Hope looks like right now. It is completely packed full of spinach and other delicious things. So really feeling like things are growing. Just in the last week or so, all the grass has turned green and all the trees are budding out. It is very cold today, however, but spring is really here. So today we're going to talk about watering and plant care and harvesting a little bit. We have a little bit less on our agenda for tonight so that we have lots of time for question and answers at the end. But like before, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question or type it in the chat box, and I will keep an eye on that. And then before we leave each other tonight, I'm just going to show you guys a couple other things that are happening at Growing Hope if you're interested in getting involved. And the image on the right is actually an aerial view of the farm from a couple of years ago. And I thought it might be nice to see in terms of our discussion about spacing last week. You can actually see in this image how densely packed the plants are, you can kind of see some of the individual plants. So you can see like how we really pack stuff in so it is fully using all of the space that we have. It's also just kind of fun sometimes to see the farm from a different angle. This was during an event that we were having a couple of years ago, and so there's a couple like tents and stuff up for, I believe it was cocktail hour. I wanted to take a minute to acknowledge the land that I am on, and the land wherever you guys are, that you are on, and also acknowledge that this is unceded territory owned by the people of the Three Fires, the Anishinaabe people, and that I want to honor the thousands of years that they took care of this land and cared for and managed this land. And I want to verbalize that the myth that this land was empty. Before European colonists came to this land, it was inhabited, it was managed, cared for, and loved. And this space that I am on in Southeast Michigan was all a large farm. From here all the way out to the Great Plains was managed in sustainable farming practices for the people. And there's this idea that when the colonists came, the land was empty and it was just all sitting around, but that is not true. That is a myth. This land was cared for and lived on. And I am so grateful to the ancestors that did care for this land for so long and took care of the soils so that we can still farm it now. I also want to take a second in my own head and welcome you to as well to think about what we can do to honor those whose land this is and to support a reconciliation process where we give back land to the people who it was stolen from, give back management of the land, give back power in deciding policies for the land. And I just want to think about, when we're thinking about growing food or flowers and really getting our hands in the land, I always like to start each of my days in the garden with thinking about what does a respectful and reciprocal relationship with the land mean to me? What can I do today to give care for the land? What can I do today to take care of the land for future generations? And what can I do in joining collective larger efforts to care for this land? Without this amazing land, this fertile soil that we have in Southeast Michigan, without all of the water, we would not be able to live here. And we are facing a huge climate crisis. It is upon us. We are suffering already from it. And so I want to think about the fact that what we do now has huge, huge effects. And even though oftentimes those effects are hidden from us, like the oil spills, the over 380 oil spills that have already happened in the Keystone Pipeline, or the largest on-land oil spill in U.S. history right down the road from us in Kalamazoo. This picture on the left is a picture of the Kalamazoo River after almost 1 million gallons of oil was spilled directly into the river, displacing over 150 families, contaminating hundreds of miles of wetlands, and causing the water to be poisoned, the water that we depend on to grow our crops, to drink. and that oftentimes things like this happen and we don't know. The oil spills are not front page news, even when they are the biggest in US history. And I think about the way in which agriculture has used the land, thinking of the land not in a respectful way, not as something to be in relationship with, but something to extract from, to extract resources, to use, to cover up. And that approach is what is bringing us into this climate crisis. It is what is causing harm to so many people all over the world. And I hope that with all of our work, with our hands in the soil, putting love into the soil, that we can keep the larger picture in mind, and that will transform our relationship with the soil, and that will transform relationships with other people in our community in relation to the soil as well. So I just thank you all for caring about the soil and for gardening and growing food to nourish yourself and your families. And I ask that you keep this larger picture in mind as you do that. So I think that everyone on here tonight has been in previous classes, so I'll just say Growing Hope's mission is to foster an equitable and sustainable local food system where all people are empowered to grow, sell, buy, prepare, and eat nourishing food. Thank you for joining us tonight. I am Bea Ayer. I used to be the Director of Programs as well as the Farm and Garden Manager at Growing Hope. I have retired that hat a little bit now, but I am really happy to still be supporting the mission and the work of Growing Hope. Even though I am not the director anymore, I love the organization, and I'm so glad that you guys are all with us tonight. So before we go on to the new topics, I just wanted to do a quick review from last week. Last week we talked about caring for the soil, but we also talked about the spacing that plants need, for optimal growth, and the concept of holistic or more sustainable pest and disease management. And last week I tried to really talk about the larger idea of how to prevent pests and diseases, with the hopes that it would be easier to understand like a systems approach to it, and then when you come into contact with specific insects or diseases, that you're able to identify those through some of the handouts. Of course, there's like apps on your phone, there's websites, books from the library. So you can definitely learn about all of the different individual pests and diseases, but I do think what's most important is kind of an overall understanding of how to prevent those pests and diseases, and then how to figure out what to do once you find them. So we talked about the three different categories of ways to interfere in this cycle, through physical means, so physically picking off caterpillars or moving plants, biological, so either through beneficial insects or treatments like bacteria or nematode treatments. Biological is also, planting flowering crops to attract pollinators and other beneficial pests. And then the last choice would be a way to chemically interfere with the pest or disease cycle through a pesticide, a fungicide, something like that. And of those chemical treatments, there's both there's harmful and less harmful treatments for the plants and for us. So there's things like using baking soda or vinegar or raw milk for fungal or bacterial diseases, and then everything to using a synthetic chemical. And then we talked a little bit about some of the beneficial insects and how to look out for them. So I wanted to just take a minute here and see if anyone has any questions from last week, if anything didn't make sense now that you've had some time to think about it, or if anything came up in any of the handouts that would be helpful to discuss. And feel free to unmute yourself or type in the chat box.
I have a question regarding spacing.
Yes.
So, in the last class, we said that the squash is something which is spread a lot by its own. So, is it recommended to have its squash in its own bed, or we can create separate pod within a bed to separate out the plants?
So, and I think you're talking about like winter squash, like butternut or acorn.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so each of those plants can take up a lot of space, up to 12 feet on their own. So depending on what your growing space is like, you can put the plants in a raised bed, like in a 4x4 foot raised bed, and then allow all their arms to grow out over the sides of the bed and onto the ground, and they will, just kind of grow and spread out. That's one option. And as long as there's good soil in the bed, the plant might, it might grow some roots in other areas where it's growing along the ground, but it'll still get most of its nutrients from where you actually planted the original plant. The other option would be to, put it in a bed by itself and grow things with it together. So corn and squash are often grown together. So the squash grows along the ground underneath the corn, and then the corn grows up tall. And so that's a way to grow two things in one space. And sometimes people even add beans or something like that to the mix. That's the kind of well-known Three Sisters garden. So it kind of depends on your space and what else you're wanting to grow.
Right.
That answered
no, you did. But is it possible that squash can cross the bed and it can go to other bed? I mean, is there a way to prevent it?
Yeah, you can just move it. Yeah, so you can actually so squash is a vine, and so it sends out little shoots with their own little arms, and on each of those little arms there'll be flowers and leaves and tendrils. But if they're growing in a place you don't want them, you can just literally pick them up and move them, as long as you don't pull the plant out from the ground.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions about spacing or soil or pests?
I have a question about vinegar. You had mentioned that for the fungal or whatever, but can you pour it directly on the leaves of a weed that you want to try to kill that weed, or in the cracks of the sidewalk? Yes,
you can. A good weed killer is actually salt and vinegar in water.
Okay.
It does better at killing very, very small plants or preventing new seeds from germinating. So if you have large weeds or something like that, it's best to pull them out. But say if you have a brick patio and there's plants growing between the bricks, you can use a vinegar and salt spray.
What's the ratio?
You know what? I would actually look it up to check, but I think it's around a cup of vinegar and a quarter cup of salt to a gallon of water.
Okay.
But I would check. And then I use vinegar sometimes as an antifungal spray. It's very acidic.
Right.
So you can spray it on the leaves, if you have something. It's not something you'd want to spray on all of the leaves, because it can damage the leaves. And then depending on the soil that you're growing on, you don't want to put a lot of vinegar into the soil where your plants are growing, unless they're blueberries, and then they will thank you for it because they love acidic soil. But tomatoes and stuff like that really don't like growing in very acidic soil.
All right, thanks.
Yeah.
it's actually, so if you pour it right on the leaves, is
Mhm.
it less likely to get into the soil but still kill the weed or no?
Yeah, yeah. If you
Okay.
like drench a leaf, it's gonna like drip.
Okay.
But yeah, if you just like spray it on a leaf, you can use like like a little mister bottle or something like that.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I love using vinegar because it's something that I have at home. It's cheap. Um, yeah. Any other questions about anything from before? All right. Well, we will go on then for today. So we're going to start out first by talking about watering. And I want to, talk a little bit about why you need to water plants because I find it very helpful in figuring out when to water plants and how much to water plants to know a little bit more about why plants need water. So plants, right, they use the sun to create sugar. So the plants use CO2 and they use water, and then they convert into sugar within the plant's leaves, which is amazing. Um, and so without the water in the leaves that are actually holding the structure of the plant together, it's very hard for that plant to photosynthesize when it's like all droopy. So for the plant to take in energy from the sun, they need to have enough moisture in them. And plant cells are a little bit different than animal cells. Plant cells are more square or brick shaped. And so when there's not enough water in those cell walls, the plants kind of tend to collapse on themselves. It'd be like if you stacked a bunch of balloons on each other and then you let all the air out in the balloons, they would kind of crumble over and, fall. And that's what happens with plants. So on the, in the top part of the plant above the soil, all of those little plant cells need to be full of water in order to hold the plant up. When plant cells are full of water and are standing straight up, that is called turgidity, and that what actually helps the plant have its actual structure and hold the structure. And then the other big reason why why plants need water is so that they can actually absorb the nutrients from the soil. So in the soil, and there's like a zoomed in picture on the bottom right hand side here. In the soil, there are all these little different soil particles, right, with all the nutrients in them. And then there are also bacteria and fungi living in the soil. And when there is moisture in the soil, it actually takes some of the nutrients from those soil particles, and then the bacteria and fungi do this magic where they change the nutrients so the tiny root hairs can actually absorb them. The tiny hairs on roots that you see, those are actually there's like spaces where they can absorb in nutrients in them, which is pretty amazing. But it is the bacteria and the fungi that allows them to do that. So when you water soil around a plant, the water will kind of fill up a lot of that airspace that had been before, and then that kind of makes like this little like nutrient slush that the plants can then absorb, because plants can't actually absorb nutrients straight from soil. It needs to be in a soil moisture mix. And then the bacteria and fungi actually change the chemical properties so that the plants can absorb it. So those are like two pretty, big reasons that we need water for the plants, right? And also like the reasons why we grow the plants is because we're going to eat them. And so we want to encourage our plants to be able to take as much nutrients from the ground as possible, because that's where our nutrients come from, and as much energy from the sun, because that's what our energy is going to come from. So making sure that the plant can do those two processes is really important. Does that make sense? Does anyone have questions about that? No? Okay. So, right, that's why we water, right? We water the plant because we want the plant to absorb nutrients. We water the plant because we want it to be nice and tall and turgid so it can take energy from the sun. So then the next question is, when do we water the plants and how much do we water the plants? And I think I gave you guys a little bit of the plot last week, but this is one of my favorite words, and I love talking about watering because I can use this word, evapotranspiration. So basically, when we're thinking about how much water the plant needs to continue growing, what we're thinking about is how much water is in that soil, right? So we need water in the plant itself, but we also need water in the soil, and the plant is going to get its water from the soil. Plants do have some open pores on their leaves, especially on the bottom, that can absorb a little bit of moisture, but mostly plants get all of their water from the soil. So when we talk about watering, we're not talking about watering the plant. We're talking about watering the soil around the plant. And we want that soil to have about 25% moisture in it. So if you look at that soil, it's going to be like 25% airspace, 25% moisture. Then we have all the mineral components, and then we have the smaller percent of biological material. And so, usually when you plant a seedling, you'll water it right then to make sure that there's enough moisture in the soil. And then from then on, when we water, we're basically just replacing water that's lost in the soil. And so I kind of think about it like, how do we maintain the moisture in the soil? And then to figure that out, I think about, well, how does the soil lose its moisture? Like, where does the moisture go? And there's two main places where it goes. So the moisture goes, from the sky or however you're watering, goes into the soil. And then any soil that is exposed to the sun, some of the moisture that's on the top will evaporate. Right, so the heat, wind takes a lot of moisture from the soil. So if it's a really hot, sunny, and windy day, you're probably going to lose a lot of moisture to evaporation. But if it's, a very calm, overcast day, you're not going to lose as much moisture to evaporation. And then the other way in which the soil loses its moisture is through transpiration. I'm sorry, there's a spelling check here. Spelling problem here. So basically the plant, right, it's like drinking this like soil solution from the ground through its roots. It's drawing that moisture up, all the way up to its leaves, to the fruit, wherever it's going. And through that process, the plant is actually giving off moisture as well, right? The plant is basically like breathing. So the same way in which we breathe in oxygen and then we breathe out air that has more moisture in it because it's coming out of our bodies where we have a lot of moisture. So it's the same thing for plants. So think about that like sucking motion from the soil into the plant, and then eventually the water goes out from the plant, and that is called transpiration. So it's kind of like how we lose moisture. If you're like, breathing heavy, you're gonna lose more moisture from your body. So it's kind of the same way for plants. So we have water being lost through evaporation, and we have water being lost through transpiration, and those are both affected a lot by weather. So they're affected by the heat and the wind and the sun, right? That plant is also going to lose more moisture if it's really windy. And what we want to be doing is like thinking about currently how much water the plant needs, and also be thinking about what the plant is going to need in the future. Let's see what our next one is. So, sorry, go back to slide. So when I'm thinking about if I need to water, so the first thing I'll do is, take a look at the plant itself. Like, how is the plant doing? Is the plant standing up straight and tall? Does it seem very turgid, or does it seem like it's kind of like it's flagging? The leaves are like curling, or they're falling over. The stems can fall over. You saw this picture here of the peppers on the top right-hand side. On the far right, you see pepper plants that are standing up nice and tall all by themselves. They're like fully turgid. And then on the left, you see these plants that are like flagging. They're like falling over. And so those plants need water. So I would look at that. I would look at the plant and see like, oh, does this plant need water now? And then I would look at the soil and see how the soil is. Is the soil have moisture in it? And I usually do that just with my hand. Sometimes I'll walk around my garden with a trowel and like take out chunks of soil and feel them in my hand. And we're going for, like I said, about 25% of that soil to be moisture. And so the more time you spend with your hands in the soil, you'll kind of get to know how much moisture is in that soil just by like the weight of the soil, but also how much the soil sticks together. Has anyone here ever seen when you pick up mud and you like squeeze it in your hand, it kind of makes like ribbons? Like you can kind of squeeze it and shape it almost like clay when soil is really moist. So that's actually one way to check how much moisture is in your soil, is to see if you can make a ball with it. So you hold it in your hand, compress it together, and if it holds its shape well, then it's got a lot of moisture in it. If it just completely crumbles and falls apart, then there's no moisture that's like helping to hold it together. So when I'm thinking about, when to water and how much to water, I look at the plant, see how the plant itself is doing, and then I look at the soil and see how the soil is doing. And then the third thing I look at is the weather coming up. So I'm always thinking like, what is happening in my garden right now when I'm in it, and what's going to happen in it later today or tomorrow. And if your plants are okay and the soil is okay, it has moisture in it, and you see rain in the near forecast, right, then you probably don't have to water. You can wait for it to rain. But if you don't see any rain coming, then you're going to want to think, okay, how quickly am I going to lose this moisture? So how quickly is that evapotranspiration going to happen? The hotter it is, the windier it is, right, you're going to lose more moisture. So I will think about those three things: the plant currently, the soil currently, and then the future weather before I decide to water. I try not to water when I don't need to, because I want that water to stay in the ground. Also, if you water and you don't need to, you can actually cause problems for your plants, because most vegetable plants don't like growing in very moist soil. It can cause diseases to spread. So you really want to water when your plants need it, but not overwater. So then when you're watering, the other thing to think about is like, how is this water going to stay in the ground? And this brings us back to the soil and the soil structure and texture, which we talked about in our first class. So some soils will drain water faster than others. So most of Ypsilanti has very sandy soil, and sand, right, has very large particles. It's like the largest mineral particles in a soil. And you can kind of see on the right here, I have a diagram. If you really zoomed into sand, what you would see is like all of these little pieces of sand, right? They're fairly large aggregates. And because of that, there's a lot of space between them for water and air, which means that sand will drain fastest. So if you have a very sandy soil, it's not going to hold on to that water. That water is going to penetrate through that sand and really, continue going downwards just from the force of gravity alone. If you have a very clayey soil, which is the bottom one, right, and these are the kind of like the finest particles, but they're also shaped like bricks. They form these layers, these horizontal layers, and that is why clay can absorb and hold so much water. And that's why clay soils tend to dry out slowest, because they actually will hold onto that water between their particles. It's kind of like suspended in there, which is pretty amazing. So if you have very sandy soil, you're going to want to probably water more often. And if you have very clayey soils, you're probably going to want to water less. And in fact, this weekend, I spent quite a bit of time at my home garden where I have clay soils, actually digging drainage ditches, because my soil holds on to water too much and I need more drainage. So, all right, so that's like, thinking about, okay, how fast is this water going to go through the soil itself, and how much do I need to put down? The other question is, what are you watering? So there are plants that have very, very deep roots, and there are plants that have very shallow roots. So one example that many people are familiar with is grass. Right, our lawns are made out of grass, and if you look at the roots of grass, they really only go down about, like, depending on the soil underneath, but sometimes it's like 8 inches, but they really grow out very horizontally. Lettuce is a small plant. It doesn't need to really hold on to soil too deeply to keep it from toppling over, because they're normally so short. And it just has this habit of horizontal roots. Beets, on the other hand, which is all the way on the right on this picture here, right, we're growing it for the roots themselves. But beets also just have deeper roots. They have a deeper root system. They're more vertical. And so what you'll find is that if you have a lot of lettuce growing, you actually don't need to water for that long, because what we're watering for, right, is to make that nice soil water mix at the level where the roots are. So in this graphic here, it says that like lettuce is like, I guess it's about 2 feet when it's like fully mature, for, I don't know, this is probably romaine or something like that, right? So you don't need to put enough water that moisture is going to penetrate down 8 feet. You only need to put enough water for 2 feet. But for beets, right, you really need to do a deep watering. So you're going to need to physically put more water on the ground for it to be able to penetrate that deep into the soil. So there's some things that, we water more often, but when we water them with less water. So we water, for a shorter amount of time. And those things happen to be things that are usually just smaller plants. Usually smaller plants need less water. And then the plants that have very horizontal root structures, they're going to need watering more often, because those roots are so close to the so close to the top of the ground. Where larger plants like tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, beets, carrots, other things that have deep roots where you want the roots, those you're going to want to water pretty deeply, so the amount of time that you water is usually going to be longer, but you're going to do it less often, because, as you can see in this diagram here with the beets, right, there's not a lot of evaporation that's happening to the water that's like 3 feet underground, because it's not exposed to the air as much. So it's going to stay there longer. And so that means you don't have to water quite as frequently. And of course, this is also affected by your soil type. So, if you're growing lettuce in sand, you're going to have to water very frequently, but not a lot. If you are growing beets in clay, you know, you might get away with like watering once during the whole season, because that clay is going to hold on to the water. The other thing to think about how often and how much to water is the life stage of the plant. So when the plant is changing life stages, so when it's transitioning into fruiting, so say when tomatoes start to flower, that's when they're starting to then focus on growing out their seeds, and so they're gonna send their energy into that fruit, right? That's like the swollen ovary around the seeds. So when that is happening, fruiting crops really like to have consistent water. So I'm always like out looking at my tomatoes and peppers and kind of waiting for all of those, for there to be like a big mass of flowers. And that's when I know like, okay, I want to give my plants a little bit extra water right now because they're going through such a big change. Sometimes I kind of think about it as like, you know, if you're feeding like a group of teenage boys, you need a lot of food, right? They're like going through a transition, they're growing a lot, they're changing a lot, and they need a lot of food to do that. So sometimes I remind myself of that. And then the other thing about, you know, when you'd want to water for tomatoes or not water is with harvesting. So if you water a tomato a lot, pretty like close to when you're going to harvest it, that tomato, right, is taking a bunch of water up from the soil and sending it all throughout the plant. So it's actually, you know, when it takes water from the soil, first it goes the roots and then the stalks and the leaves, and then eventually goes into the fruit. But when we're harvesting the fruit of a tomato, we don't really want them to be like fully full of water. We actually want them to have less water because the water, it like literally waters down the taste of the tomato. So I actually cut off water to my tomatoes before I'm gonna harvest them. And I also make sure to harvest them all before rain, because I want to get those tomatoes with as much sugar in it as possible. I don't want it to be a watered down flavor. Now, greens like lettuce, spinach, kale, collards, things like that, it's like the opposite. You want to make sure that those are watered really well before you harvest them. So usually the day before I'm going to do a big greens harvest, I will water that bed really well. I'll put a sprinkler on it or turn on drip for a while, because I actually want those leaves to be as turgid as possible. I want that plant to have as recently as possible taken nutrients from the soil, and to have like a good, you know, a good structure to the leaf itself. I don't want to be like harvesting like limp lettuce. So it's a little bit different. So for greens and things like that, you want to think about watering before you harvest. And for fruits, especially tomatoes, you don't want to water before you harvest. Now, if you're growing things in the same bed together, you know, you got to take the average. But you know, if you have your plants separated, you can water your beds to different amounts. Another thing to do would be like if you have an area of your garden that has heavier clay soils, to think about planting something there that's going to have deeper roots and that can really take advantage of that moisture. All right, before we talk about methods, let's see if anyone has questions about how to know when to water or why or how much. Oh, and I should say, as far as how much, most vegetable plants need about an inch of water a week. In Michigan, that means that oftentimes during the summer and fall, we don't have to water at all because historically we get fairly consistent rainstorms. But you know, during droughts, we don't get that. Does anyone have any questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
When you're planting different veggies in the same like container and you're thinking about watering veggies adding different amounts? Like, how should you consider that?
Yeah, you're just gonna want to like take the average. So, if you plant like lettuce and half beets, you're gonna want to just like, try to water enough so that the moisture will penetrate down to the beets. So think about like averaging them out. So every time you water, you know that, the water goes at least 4 feet down. But yeah, it's just by basically taking an average. If you're putting things together in the same bed or like the same container, you're gonna basically water for the plant that needs the most amount of water.
Okay, thank
Yeah, yeah, it's a good question. All right, so then another question I have for you guys is like, why would we not want to over water? Like knowing what we know about how plants uptake nutrients, is there any reason why we would want to not over water?
Would you just get too many nutrients? So it would almost become like toxic.
It could, yeah, depending. As long as the plant is transpiring, right? So as long as that like sucking action is happening, it's going to continually take moisture from the soil. Yeah, it could get too much. But yes, the other answer is yeah, the roots will rot, right? Because we need that air space. We do want about 25% of our soil to be airspace. And that is to prevent the roots from rotting. And it's also to allow that bacteria and fungus to live, because without that bacteria and fungus in the soil, the plants won't be able to absorb the nutrients at all. So, we don't want the roots to rot. We don't want to like water down the taste of our tomatoes, but we also want to make sure that we're creating a really nice environment for that bacteria and fungus, because that's what we depend on. So it's kind of like, I think it's always strange to think about like taking care of the bacteria in the soil, but sometimes I like think about taking care of the bacteria and the fungus in the soil even more than I think about the plants above the soil. So great. All right, so I want to talk about a couple different methods of watering. So the first method is just hand watering with a hose, or a watering can, something that you're like taking water from one source and carrying it into your garden and watering. There's a whole variety of sprinklers that shoot water in like all different ways to all different distances. There's the sprinklers that are go in circles. There's the ones that kind of oscillate back and forth. There's ones that go into the ground and like send water in one direction. So then there's a couple other options. One is soaker hoses. So soaker hoses are basically hoses that have a lot of small holes in them, and the water is being released through the hose itself, not through something put at the end of the hose. And a reason that I recommend doing soaker hoses over sprinklers is that when you are using a sprinkler system, the water that is shot up into the air, and so you're much more likely to lose that moisture due to evaporation in the air or from just the wind physically blowing it out of your garden. So doing, an overhead sprinkler is really like the way to lose the most amount of water. So if you are going to use a sprinkler, I usually tell people to do it, on a not so sunny day and also not on a very windy day. So sometimes that just means like, using a sprinkler in the morning. And sprinklers, you can buy them at any of the big box stores or nurseries. They're fine to use, but they do lose the most amount of water, where a soaker hose is putting that water directly on the ground, right? And that's where we want the water to go. Like, we don't want the water on top of the plant. We want the water underneath the plant. So a soaker hose or drip irrigation or micro sprinklers, anything that you can do to keep that moisture as close to the soil as possible is good. There's also flood irrigation, where you basically release a lot of water over a soil area. And that you're going to obviously lose a lot of water to evaporation as well, because it's going to go everywhere, right, in the garden, not just where you have the plants where you want them. So there's different methods, and they all have pros and cons. Hand watering is great because you can like really stand there and look at your plant and like see how it's doing and see the soil absorb the moisture, but then you're like lugging around heavy water. Sprinklers are great if you have a large area that you want to water, or if you want to put them on a timer or something like that. But right, you're going to lose a lot of water to evaporation. Soaker hoses are great. They're more expensive though, and they're a more expensive way to water. And then unfortunately, I have found that the groundhogs kind of like chewing on them. So that's not my favorite. Flood, you just don't have the control of where the water is. And then drip irrigation is great. The picture here on the right is a type of drip line. It is basically like a thick black tubing that every about 8 inches has just a little hole in it, and so the water is like coming out, but like very, very slowly. And drip irrigation is great because it's something you can set up at the beginning of the season. You can even put it on a timer if you want, and it's just you always have that down, and you can plant right into it. And the other nice thing about the drip irrigation is that if you have a sandier soil where that water is going to like really go away fast, doing a drip irrigation, it's just watering slower, so it's like letting there be more time for that moisture to be absorbed into the soil colloids or for your roots to absorb it. And then micro sprinklers are basically like little tiny sprinklers put on a smaller line, and you can get individual emitters to do like individual plants, or you can do different areas. But it's really up to you what works for you, what works for your garden, what you have. I have a drip irrigation system set up in my garden, and I have that down permanently. I only really take it up when I am adding compost to the bed or something like that. I transplant around it. However, when I am direct seeding, if I'm like putting in lettuce seed, I actually prefer to use a sprinkler, because when I'm seeding something that is like over a whole bed, I really want that whole bed to have even moisture on it. And a drip, you're going to have more moisture right around that tubing, so you're not going to have as even moisture distribution on the top layers. Once you get down about 6 or 8 inches, then it's going to be more even because it'll just even out on its own. But so even if you do have drip irrigation, there still might be times that you choose a different type of watering, depending on what you have and what size it's in. I would never use a sprinkler or overhead watering though on tomatoes. Oopsies. Sorry about that. On tomatoes or eggplants or peppers, those things that are in the nightshade family, the solanum family, there are a lot of plant diseases that are carried in the soil. And if you use a sprinkler, basically the soil can like bounce back up onto the leaves. Basically, the water hits the soil and then it like, bounces up and it kind of splashes some soil on the bottom leaves. And that's often how you get blight in tomatoes. And then also there are, there's bacteria, fungus like Oomycetes that spread via moisture on the leaf itself. So I don't ever overhead water the fruit crops. Also, like cucumbers, I would never overhead water. But I would overhead water greens, so lettuces, spinach, collards, things like that. So there are plants that have, preferences basically on how they get watered. And if you have multiple ways of watering, you can water your plants differently. But if you don't, just do what you have. Sometimes, I've been known every now and then to use a sprinkler on my tomatoes if I'm like really desperate. But I do try not to. Oops. And then, just thinking about how much water you need to put down. What I like to do every season when I'm setting up a new irrigation method is I'll water for however long I think I need to water, and then I take my trowel and I actually dig in the soil and I see how far down that water went. And then I know, I have an idea of how long I need to water to get the water down deep enough for the roots that I want. So especially when you're doing like tomatoes or something like that, or beets, right? Those roots are just going to be really deep. And so you want to make sure that you are watering long enough that the water can penetrate down that far. Yeah. So does anyone have any questions about watering? Or anything that we were just speaking about?
I have a question about irrigation of raised beds.
Yeah.
For drip irrigation.
Mhm.
If you need some special system, or you can just like run, a drip hose from the water source up the side or something.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. So this isn't the best picture, but you may be able to tell. Normally, what people do for raised beds, especially wooden beds, is that they'll use tubing, like 1 inch or 3/4 inch tubing between the beds that has no holes in it, or up the side of the bed, and then from that attach the drip irrigation. So you have two different tubing. You have the tubing that's the drip irrigation itself that has the holes in it, and then you have the tubing that carries the water between the beds. And you just connect those together. And you can use, you can either just like lay it on the ground, unless you're clumsy like me, and then I would definitely trip over it. So then I would either bury it or put it actually in the bed itself. So sometimes what I'll do is I will put, if I do have the tube on the outside of the bed, then I'll just attach it to the bed with like sometimes I'll use like a plumber strap, or just little like EMT holders. They're at the hardware store. They sell it with the electrical conduit, and they're like little C-shaped pieces of metal where you put a screw in, and they hold that tubing onto the outside of your bed, so it's nice and tight, so you don't just trip on it. Did that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Great. Yeah, and there used to be very, very few options when it came to drip irrigation that you could buy at the retail level, but actually now most of the big box stores, and I noticed even like some of our local hardware stores, are actually starting to carry these drip irrigation supplies, because people are starting to use them instead of sprinklers, because, well, we have a very limited amount of fresh water. So the less you can use, the better. All right. So we've talked about a lot in the last 4 weeks: how to design your garden, how to get familiar with your soil, how to know, what to grow and how much space it needs, and how to water, what to do about pests and diseases. So the next thing is really like, how do you care for your plants once they're in the ground? Once you have, all of your basics set up and you get, your seeds in the ground, then what do you do? So I'm going to talk about 4 specific crops, and we can talk about other crops as well. But these are some good ones to talk about in terms of care. So the first one is tomatoes. So tomatoes are a vine. They grow from their main stem, and then they have all of these little offshoots. If you just left the tomatoes on their own, they would vine along the ground, almost like ivy. You know, they'll just like send out these little arms everywhere, and the fruit will be everywhere. And it's best to stake the tomatoes up off the ground, because if you let them just go on the ground, oftentimes the fruit that's on the ground will rot, or insects will get to it. So most people stake their tomatoes, and staking basically means giving your plant a support to hold on to. So instead of just relying on the stem of the plant to hold itself up, you're giving it some other object that it can rest on. And this helps keep your plants off the ground. It also makes them easier to harvest. And there's all sorts of different ways you can stake things. On the left, what we have here is like a horizontal trellis. So it's 2 stakes or T-posts, or something in the ground, and then string basically between them at different levels. And I do this method for tomatoes. I usually have T-posts and like wire, or like a string that I put between them. And what I do is I actually do what's called a weave. So I have strings like on both sides of the tomato, and that holds it up. So I basically am like weaving the string in between the plants and then going back the opposite way. So the plants are really like held up tight together. That way is a little bit more labor intensive than using something that's like a cage, or just has more for the plant to grab onto. But I find that it's the easiest way to harvest a plant. So I'm not having to like reach my hand through a cage or something. I can just pull the fruit right off the plant. But cages work great too. There's those like 3-level tomato cages that are probably like the most popular cages to use. But you can also just use, a piece of fencing turned in a circle. And basically what is going to happen is your plant's going to grow up, and then you can send the little arms of the plant with the fruit out through that cage. And so it helps hold up the weight of the plant. And then in the middle here, we have this like funky spiral trellis. It's basically like a piece of wire, thick wire that's in the shape of a circle, and the plant, right, it grows up in the middle of it, and then that wire holds up the fruit. Because really what we want to be doing for tomatoes is keeping the fruit off the ground, so it doesn't rot, and so the pests don't get to it. You can, you don't have to stake your tomatoes, but it's a good idea. And I would actually say with all fruiting crops other than winter squash or summer squash, you want to do some sort of stake or cage to support those plants, because a tomato plant can have like 30 pounds of fruit on it at one time. So these plants, especially if you have a tomato plant that's like 8 feet tall and full of fruit, is really heavy. So, you really do want to give it a nice, good support to keep it off the ground. So here's some other examples. On the left is how you stake tomatoes for commercial production in a greenhouse. So we just basically, you can see that like a lot of the lower leaves are taken off, as well as all the other stems. So you get this like skinny plant that basically is being held up by a string being wrapped around it. So you have a piece of string that's hanging from the purlin at the top of the greenhouse, and then goes all the way down to the bottom of the plant. And as the plant grows, you just twist it around the string, and then it holds it up. But that's something for commercial growing or really dense growing. However, you can use that same idea of using the string to hold it up at a garden scale. Here's 2 different examples of trellises. The one in the middle is bamboo. The one on the bottom, I think, is just dimensional lumber, maybe 2x2s or 1x2s. But either way, it's like finding a way to hold these strings up at the top, right? And you want it to be as high as you're gonna let your tomato plants get. It's common in Michigan to get like 8-foot tall tomatoes. So you wanna make sure that that trellis is nice and tall. And then it, is sturdy. It's not gonna fall over. It's gonna be able to hold the weight of those plants on it. And then the other thing about tomatoes is pruning. So pruning is when you are selectively taking out part of the plant in favor of having the plant use its energy for other parts. So there's 2 types of tomatoes. There are tomatoes that are indeterminate, and there's tomatoes that are called determinate. And indeterminate means that they will flower all summer long, and then every time it flowers, it'll be forming tomatoes. Right, so you're having tomatoes ripen all throughout the season. You're able to harvest week after week. A determinate means that the plant is going to send out all of its flowers in one go. So in 1 week, all of those flowers are going to be there. All of those flowers are going to turn into fruit. And then after you harvest that, there's no more flowering. So most people plant indeterminate tomatoes, like the big beefsteak tomatoes, super sweet, pear tomatoes, most like Roma or paste tomatoes are indeterminate because people want to be able to harvest all throughout the season. Most people don't want like 50 pounds of tomatoes 1 week and then none the next week. So most people grow indeterminate tomatoes. And then the other thing is to think about pruning. So if you're growing indeterminate tomatoes, you can prune them. And we prune in different ways depending on the season. So what I always tell people is to let your tomatoes grow until you have the second flower cluster. So on this picture here on the right, we have 1 flower cluster. So I would let this plant go probably another week or so before I did anything to it until it has the second flower cluster. And then I'm gonna trim off the first flower cluster, and I'm gonna trim off any suckers that are below the flower cluster. So in this picture, you can see between the stem that has the leaves growing on it and the main stem of the plant, in that little nook there, you get something that's called a sucker. And all tomatoes grow this way. This is how they grow in more of like a bushy form. And each of those suckers can become a stem on its own. So if you were to let that sucker continue to grow, out of that sucker, then you would have leaves and flower clusters and growing tip as well. So it's like a tree, right? That's like branching out. And the more branches, the more suckers that you let go on the tomato, the more stems you're gonna have, which means the bigger and bushier the plant is gonna be. And most people want to actually kind of limit the size of their tomatoes because tomatoes can get so heavy. So pruning tomatoes helps to, keep the trellises up. But the other reason is that in that picture that we saw, actually I'll go back to it. Oops, where is it? Here we go. On the left-hand side in the commercial production, you see that main stem, and then you see just like a ton of tomatoes on each stem. It's just like, it looks like grapes. They're like a huge cluster. And you will get more tomatoes per square foot from having multiple plants that are pruned than fewer plants, but more bushy plants. So if you're really going for like the most amount of tomatoes per square foot, you want to prune your tomatoes back really hard because that one stem then is going to create these like really, really huge dense clusters of fruit. So like I was saying, I wait to prune until I get that second flower cluster, and then the first prune, I'm gonna take off all of the suckers below that flower cluster, and then in a week or 2, I'm gonna come back and actually take off those leaves. So like I was saying before, tomatoes and peppers and eggplants all have several diseases that are in the soil, and when the soil, you get like a splashback from irrigation or rain, the soil is more likely to hit those lower leaves. And so I actually just remove all of those leaves, and that way the soil won't get on it and the plant won't get a disease. Tomatoes also have diseases that often affect the older leaves first. So when taking off those lower, older leaves, you're also kind of postponing the disease or kind of holding it back. There are many people who grow tomatoes that don't prune it at all, and that's totally fine. You can do that. It really just depends on, you know, how you're trellising them. If you have a tomato cage, it's going to be it would make more sense to have more arms on your tomato, to have it be bushier. But if you're just using a single string, like in that commercial production, you really only want to have 1 or 2 main stems, and that means you're going out and taking off all the suckers. So I usually prune my tomatoes once a week during the growing season. I try to, because if you don't do it every week, you know, if you only do it every 3 weeks or so, you're going to have to take off a lot more when you do it. And so it's just going to take longer. But we're pruning it, right, to keep the plant from being too heavy to topple over our trellising system. We're pruning the plant to make it easier to harvest. We're pruning the plant to encourage heavier set, more dense flower clusters that will turn into fruit. We're pruning the plant to keep the disease from splashing on it. And another reason you could prune your plant is because you're just done letting it grow. There's some point in the year where the tomatoes outside are just tall enough, and I'll just cut the growth tip off, and they'll basically stop growing at that point, because it doesn't really make sense for me to have tomatoes in my garden that I have to use a ladder to harvest. So I'll usually just cut them off at some point. I'll have to say, enough, had enough. So another plant that you want to trellis is cucumbers. Cucumbers are also a vine, and they love to climb. Cucumbers have these little tendrils that they send out that will actually grab onto things and hold them to it, where tomatoes don't have that. And so with tomatoes, you have to physically clip them or somehow keep them in the stake. Cucumbers will attach themselves, which is really nice. Again, you can grow cucumbers on the ground. That's definitely how people do it at scale, where tomatoes are like very heavily pruned in farm production. Cucumbers are not. They're let to grow on the ground. But of course, having fruit on the ground, you're going to have more disease and more rot, more insects, things like that. So providing a trellis is nice. You can, you know, there's so many options for trellises. You can build something out of wood with string. You can use old pieces of fence. You can use old like wire that's bent around. Basically anything that those cucumber tendrils can hold on to and hold the weight of the plant, you can use. So I've seen all sorts of things, all sorts of things. So another plant that has very, very different growing conditions would be a potato or a sweet potato that grows below the ground. With both, the roots come off of the main stem of whatever you start with. So you're going to start with like a seed potato, and out of that stem, the roots are going to grow out. And we actually do what is called hilling with potatoes. So as potatoes grow their stem above ground, we actually put soil higher and higher onto that plant. So we end up actually covering the leaves and the stem, because the longer that stem is underground, the more potatoes it's going to produce. So I usually hill my potatoes like 2 or 3 times per season, and I'll do it at the beginning of the season. So on the top left-hand corner, what you see is plants that have about 3 branches with leaves on them, and that's when I'm going to go ahead and hill them. I usually do it when there's about 3 to 4 above ground, and I'm actually going to go ahead and put soil all the way up to that top leaf part. So I'm covering that stem, covering those leaves in soil, and then out of that stem underground, it'll grow more potatoes. And then on the right, you can see a cross section of a sweet potato. Sweet potatoes are pretty similar, and you can see that there's like sweet potatoes going up vertically the stem, and that's because it's been hilled. So the what is above ground, when it is covered in soil, will grow roots.
How many times do you do that? Do you do it just once or do you do it more than once?
I usually do it about twice for sweet potatoes, and I try to do it 3 for my regular potatoes.
Okay.
Last year I did it 0 times in my garden because I didn't have time, and I still had enough potatoes. So, you know, kind of
Okay.
depends on you. But the more you hill it, you know, the more potatoes you're gonna get. And then once I do it 3 times or so, then I'll just let the plant go. You don't want to do it like every week. Yeah. All right, so just a couple more things, and then we'll just leave some time for questions. So salad greens, there's 2 ways of harvesting salad greens. There is a way in which you can harvest the entire plant at once, or you can harvest it so that you can come back and harvest again the following week or following 2 weeks. So on the left-hand side, we have a romaine head here, and you can see someone is cutting that whole head. So someone's got the entire plant in their hand, and then they're cutting it off almost at the soil level. So just where the beginning of the leaves are coming out. And that, right, you're taking pretty much the entire plant, and so that plant's not going to regrow. Sometimes in like bok choys or things like that, it will regrow, but they're not going to be as good. They're going to be like small little offshoots. But if you want a nice head, right, you have to harvest the whole plant. So that's just fine. You just gotta, know that that's what's going to happen, right? So that you harvest once and then you're done. Another option is to harvest the plants at what's called like a baby or a teenage stage. So it's before the leaves have gotten big enough to start creating a head. It's when there's just individual leaves, and you're going to cut those off. And when you cut those off, you want to look at the base of that plant, and what you'll see in the middle picture here where that white arrow is that on the outside, right, there's like leaves that are growing up tall. You can see the stems of them. But there's also what's called the growing point or the growing tip, and that's in the middle of the plant, and that's basically the next leaf. So when you harvest so that you can harvest again, you want to leave that growth tip. You want to leave the next round of leaves to continue to grow. So you're just going to cut right above that growth tip, cut the stems there, and then for this, I believe that this is a picture of Mizuna. Mizuna, usually within like a week, you'll be able to harvest again nice 3 to 6 inch leaves, depending on the time of year. But you can come through with a knife or use scissors, and this is called cut and come again, is what it is called. But you'll see that also, like, as you do this multiple times, so maybe on your 3rd cutting, you're going to notice that there's also these like long stems that'll be in your mix, and that's how you decide when it's kind of done. When your bed is like mostly stems, then you're done. So for like Mizuna, arugula, lettuce, baby kale, things like that, things that you're going to use as like a baby salad mix, you usually do a cut and come again, and you can usually get about 2 to 3 cuttings out of it. So I'll cut, and then I'll I don't know, about 10 days later, I'll come back and I'll cut it again. And I can do that usually about 2 or 3 times for baby plants. I prefer to do things cut and come again because, I don't know, I guess I just prefer baby or medium-sized salad greens. But it is much more labor intensive, and of course it uses a lot more seeds, because instead of using one seed to produce a whole huge head of lettuce, you're using a lot of seeds for a lot of tiny plants. So here's just like some varieties of things that you can cut and come again. And oh yes, look, it's showing us here in this picture iceberg. guess you can cut iceberg off, and it will form these like tiny little heads around next to it. But what's also here, you can see kale, red mustard, pak choi. Any greens can really be used as a salad green if you cut them when the leaves are really small. And you know, having a little bit of red mustard or red Russian kale mixed in with your lettuce, it's pretty. You know, it's nice looking, and it's. I think we all deserve our food to be beautiful, so I love throwing that stuff in it. I also love the different textures and crunch and flavor. So, all right. So one other thing, yeah, almost out of time. Just one other thing I wanted to talk about is mulching. So mulching is basically you use an organic matter or non-organic matter to prevent weed growth. So it's covering those weed seeds so they don't see the sun, so they don't grow. It's holding the moisture in the bed so you get less evaporation. Depending on what you use, it can add organic matter to the bed, which is great for the following years. It can prevent your soil from washing away in like a big thunderstorm or rain. And then it can also actually help keep that soil warmer, especially in the spring, because it's basically like an insulating layer. And mulching, you can use all sorts of different things. Some people use straw. Don't use hay. Hay has seeds in it. Straw is like supposed to be mostly the stem of the plant. A lot of commercial growers grow on plastic. This is a black plastic with eggplants planted in it. And you can tell, right, that plastic, like no weed is going to grow up underneath that plastic and come through. That plastic is really going to prevent any weeds from growing up. Of course, a downfall of plastic is that it is plastic. It's made from petroleum, and you know, it's not really going to go anywhere. It's not like it's recycled. I mean, most plastic isn't recycled. Yeah, so there's plastic. They do make some biodegradable plastics now that are made from corn and things like that. But if you throw them in your garbage and the city comes and pick it up, it's not going to decompose. It's the same. It's just trash. You can also use newspaper. If you use newspaper, what I recommend is not using too much shiny paper. So just use the plain matte paper, and then not full color. The black and white is safer. And then you're going to need to hold that paper down some way so it doesn't blow away. So what I like to do when I use newspaper is I'll get it really nice and wet. That keeps it like heavy, and then I'll actually put like a thin layer of soil on top, so just enough to kind of keep it from blowing away. But right, it's going to prevent weeds from coming up, which is really great. And then there's something called sheet mulching, and that's in the fall if you want to really build up your soil. Sheet mulching is a great way to integrate organic matter. It's a great way to keep those weed seeds down. So one of the reasons that people don't like tilling or like mixing up the soil is that if you have weed seeds that are a foot down and you flip your soil over, you bring those weed seeds to the top, right? So you're going to get more of those seeds germinating. But if you're sheet mulching or putting mulch on top, right, you're not bringing those seeds up. And so that's a nice way to really prevent the growth of weeds and add nice organic matter to your garden. All right, so before we close, I'm just going to let you guys all know that the farmers markets are opening soon. I am so excited. I love the Ypsilanti farmers markets. So we currently have the online market, so that it's a pickup on Tuesday right downtown where Incubator Kitchen is. You order online. There is a ton of products on there, everything from like local dried cayenne pepper to Zingerman's cheeses. You can get all of that. You order, the farmers drop it off, we pack for you. You pull up and we'll put it right in your trunk. So there's the link for that. That will continue throughout the season on Tuesdays. We will also be opening up a small section of outdoor market on Tuesdays. The tap room has the street closed off right in front, and then we'll be right next to that. So we'll have about 5 or 6 different farmers out there selling their stuff. So you can do a combination of shopping in person and online, or you could just pick up online, or you could do shopping in person. whatever works for you. That starts in May. And then the Saturday market is also starting. The Saturday market we will be running like we did last year. So there'll be fewer booths and we will be limiting the number of people in at a time. But I'm really excited that those are going to start. I know all of our farmers are like really ramping up their production, getting stuff ready to go. And just one plug, we do have unlimited double up bucks right now. Double up bucks is if you use your bridge card, your EBT, also called SNAP. For every dollar that you spend in EBT, you get a dollar coupon, basically. So it's doubling your grocery budget. And right now it's unlimited. Normally I think there's a $20 limit per day on that, but right now it's unlimited. So you can go, you could spend $300 of your SNAP benefits all in one day and get an extra $300 worth of produce. So it's a really great time to be using SNAP benefits at farmers markets. And that's all throughout Washtenaw County, not just in Ypsilanti right now. And then if you would like more support in the future, we do have the Ypsilanti Gardeners discussion group on Facebook, which I moderate and answer questions on. There's also a Facebook group called Ypsilanti Plant Exchange. We may be offering more online workshops in the future. If you stop by the farm, you can talk to staff, ask them questions. We do offer garden mentorship for new growers. And then soon, we will have the free resources for folks. So for working class folks around Ypsilanti at the Growing Hope Center, there will be free seeds, seedlings, compost containers, and produce and flowers. And actually that compost and the produce and flowers, or not the flowers, but seeds, compost, and produce is already out and available at Growing Hope. Our little vegetable cart is outside, and then there's a big pile of compost in the parking lot with a sign on it. So you are welcome to access those. And then, of course, a really great way to get support is to talk to our wonderful staff during a volunteer day. If you go to growinghope.net on the right-hand corner, you'll see something that says Get Involved, and you can click on that to sign up to volunteer. And we have all sorts of volunteer opportunities. We have Wednesday and Saturday volunteer days at the farm. We're looking for Tuesday volunteers to help us with traffic flow. We are always looking for folks to help us with mailings. And of course, skilled carpenters are always welcome. We always have carpentry projects that we are looking for help for. So that is it. Thank you guys so much for participating, and want to see what questions folks have, if any.
I have a question. So the garden mentors that Growing Hope provides for new growers, so is that face-to-face, or is it also online?
It depends. So we're offering that this year. We're offering that to our home vegetable garden grower participants. So we match people with mentors who kind of have some of the same goals for their garden, and then the mentor and the mentee get to decide together whether it's in person or online. I think most people prefer it to be in person so that it's actually at the garden. But for folks in that program, if they don't feel safe having someone around, or if they would just prefer virtual, that's also an option.
Okay, and there's a way to register on the Growing Hope site?
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah. What other questions can I answer?
I have one. There was a slide you showed in one of the earlier ones with the cucumbers that look, only half of the cucumber looks developed and then the other half looks skinny. And I think you said it was a pollinating thing. Is there something you can do about that, or is that just a bad seed and you just need to start over?
It just means that at the time that flower was flowering, that there weren't enough pollinators in your area.
Okay.
So if you see that happening, what you want to do is work to attract more pollinators. So planting other flowers around your cucumbers will draw them. And if that doesn't work, you can always manually fertilize the flowers by taking the male and the female flowers and giving them a little smush.
How do you
but
know
really what you
what's
wanna
male
look
and
for-
what's female?
That's a good question. The flowers look a little bit different, and I'm trying to think if there's a picture. Probably best to just,
I can Google it.
that.
Yeah, exactly. Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't know if you had a quick answer or something.
Yeah, but really, really what that means is that they're not pollinated enough.
Okay.
Sometimes that's because it's really cold out, so cucumbers won't fertilize below 55 degrees. So if it's flowering and then it gets cold, even if the pollinators do come, the seeds won't develop because it's too cold for them. Sometimes the flowers are there and they're only flowering when it's like so windy that other pollinators can't be there. But sometimes it just means there's not enough pollinators in your area to do the work.
I'm really surprised because there's marigolds on bookending where the cucumbers are, and they always have a bunch of bees on it.
Yeah, that
Anyway.
is interesting.
Yeah.
Sometimes the other thing that can happen, sometimes if there's too high ozone, the ozone kills the seeds.
Oh.
So when we have like high ozone days, unfortunately, we're getting more and more in Michigan during like the heat of the summer.
Okay.
It can also be if it's too hot. So if it's like 100 degrees, that's too hot for the seeds too. So
All right. We'll just
Yeah.
see.
I usually get them though. Usually each of my plants, I would say, gets them, especially at the beginning, like the first couple fruit tend to do that more, and then the last couple fruit tend to do that. But the cucumbers, they'll continue to flower for many weeks.
Right.
So you can just, wait for the next one. The other thing would be with cucumbers, they will only go for so long, especially in Michigan because we have such bad powdery mildew here. So I actually do three rounds of cucumbers. So I'll plant them like 3 weeks apart, or a month apart. So
Okay. Thanks.
yeah. Any other questions that anyone has?
I think there were a couple questions in chat.
How do you all define working class? Oh, that's a great question. So we actually at Growing Hope, we let people self-identify. So we will our resources are often limited, right? And oftentimes we get resources that are only for folks that are working class or low income, but we don't like to use the term low income because oftentimes people with wealth, it's not actually income that's coming in. Sometimes they have land, trust funds, money in other places that they're benefiting from, but that's not necessarily from a job. And so we use the word working class instead of low income. And I guess what we often mean is for people who are making money through their labor and not through interest on other money. But basically, we wanna support everyone to grow, and we know that people's wealth changes, things happen, and so that's why we let people self-identify. So if you need resources, if you can't afford to go to the farmers market and support our local farmers, then we have free seedlings for you. So I don't know if that answers the question. It's a little gray, but. Let's see, are there any other questions? How to create pond within a bed. That's it. All right, well, thank you guys so much for joining me this evening. I really appreciate it. And please stay tuned to Growing Hope for other fun events. There are volunteer days happening. The markets are going to be open soon. Come June, we're going to have a big open house at the farm. So, you know, come stop by, say hello, see what's going on. There's a lot of produce coming out at the farm. I was there this morning, and just, I don't know, 2,000 seedlings or something. There's a lot of seedlings there being grown out for people. So please do stop by. And if I don't see you all again, thank you so much. My name is B. Ayer. My full name is Elizabeth B. Ayer. You can find me on the internet if you search my name or through Growing Hope. I do offer private consultation and support for gardeners, and that is also my contact info is on my website. You can get it from Growing Hope, and I'll actually put it here for everyone, just in case. Oops. So there is my email if you need to reach me, and thank you for joining me. Thank you for gardening. Thank you for growing food for yourself and those that you love. Thank you for doing it in a way that cares for our soils. So have a wonderful evening. It is beautiful out there. I'll see you guys later.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you. This was great.